All right, good evening. I appreciate you being here. Tonight is the conclusion of our study from the early chapters of the Bible, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, what we're calling foundations. And we're going to be in the 11th chapter tonight, which is primarily another genealogy. But it always catches people off guard when I say things like, you know, Noah and the flood and the Tower of Babel and all those great stories that you have from the early chapters of the Genesis, those aren't the main parts of the story. Those are God sort of fleshing out the story, but the story is the genealogy. Because from Genesis chapter 1, we have Adam and Eve created in the image of God, all the way to Genesis chapter 11, which ends with Abraham. And it is the story of human history from creation until God takes his approach to humanity, the promise that he's going to provide a way of salvation, a way to restore what's been broken by sin, and he's going to zoom that in, he's going to funnel it in to focus on a single person who will become a single nation through whom all the nations of the earth will then be blessed. So the genealogy, we skip over that. We're just like, oh, begat, 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 begat. And yet, that's precisely why this is here. Because it is the line of the promise. And from the end of Genesis chapter 11, in one sense, we have this massive parenthesis, which is the entire Old Testament, where we then pick up the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, which takes us from the garden to the Messiah. It's captivating, but you got to spend some time there to see what you can discover, to see what we can find. God writes great suspense stories, just like the greatest authors of the greatest literature. And what we have here is a conclusion of the messianic lineage that really has kind of woven its way all the way through these foundational chapters. But I really like that chapter 11 is there, because the last event, per se, that we look at in these chapters is the Tower of Babel. We saw that last week, God coming down to sort of almost jokingly examine the grand ambitions of the human race to lift themselves up so that they could contest God in his very house. He comes down to examine, and he confuses their languages. Remember, Babel originally was a word that meant gateway or doorway to heaven. It comes to mean confusion, because that's what God did there. He confused the languages. Not because I heard somebody one time teach that this was God's response to try and prevent man from becoming too powerful. Please. The reason God didn't want mankind to have a unified approach to challenging God is because, remember what has happened before this time. He made a unilateral covenant with Noah to never destroy the earth again by flood. What would be the single thing that would occur that would have justified another global destruction? I mean, what was it that brought on the flood in the first place? It was a unified, across humanity, arrogance and rebellion against God. Babel was not God trying to protect himself from mankind. Babel was God trying to protect mankind from his own unholy ambition. And by weakening us with the separation of languages, it created a world in which mankind had to learn how to cooperate, had to rediscover how to access our common humanity. In fact, to a great degree, we never have. Prejudice the bigotry that comes from being different from other people, those are sort of the sinful consequences of that Babel moment when for the first time humanity really was marked by its differences. You see, before the Tower of Babel, we only had two real categories of human beings. We had what in Genesis 6 is referred to as the sons of God and the daughters of men. That is, we had the line of those who worshiped Yahweh, the descendants of Seth, the replacement for Abel, and then we had the daughters of men, or the descendants of Cain, those that rejected God, and like Lamech and others that we looked at, Nimrod, they challenged God. That the sinful line of humanity came to dominate, which is what brought us to the need for the flood. And Babel was evidence that that sinful line, even though we started afresh, remember we had Noah and his 3 sons, 4 wives there between the 4 men. We had 8 people. We're starting fresh. If there was ever a chance to do this right, this was it. And yet, like I said, these chapters give us foundational or infant doctrines that will be played out over the rest of Scripture. And one of those foundational doctrines in its infancy is this idea of the depravity of man, the fact that we are sinners by our nature. See, we live in a generation that loves to believe that we're all essentially good. If we could just fix the world, people would be, everything that they've ever dreamed to be. Things would be wonderful. The biblical testimony is the problem is internal. And the remnant, the 8 survivors of the flood show pretty quickly, because really within short order, we go from 8 people. If you run the math and just make some basic estimates, I think the estimates are based on about 8 children per family. If you run the math, by the time we get to the Tower of Babel, humanity is probably numbering in the 30,000 range. And the text seems to imply that essentially the whole of the human race present at that time is involved at some level of agreement with this project. From man's perspective, it's let's challenge God so that we can secure our future against a further act of judgment. See, that's the human side. God's the problem. We've got to do something to guarantee that we don't get jammed up again by God getting into our business. From God's perspective, the problem is mankind is inherently sinful because his nature is damaged. And so the Tower of Babel is an act of God that is really, in the grand scheme of things, it's an act of mercy. Now, they didn't have to worry about another global flood. Why? Because God had already given them a unilateral promise that he wasn't going to do it again. Every time they looked up in the sky and saw a rainbow, that was the promise. But you got to understand the essence of sin going all the way back to the beginning. I mean, what was the temptation that tripped up Adam and Eve? It was the serpent saying, did God really say that? Well, the rainbow was in the sky every time it rained. But the way sinful man thinks about things, he saw the rainbow, but he also saw the raindrops. And when he saw the raindrops, the thought had to cross his mind, oh no, here we go again. Babel was the human attempt to secure their own future while failing to recognize that their future had already been secured because God made a unilateral promise that he imposed on himself. But we've never been good about trusting that God's word is trustworthy. And so, Babel. Well, that's where we finished last week. That was a brief review for the 2 of you that weren't here. So let's look at the rest of chapter 11. We're just going to pick up, and it's going to be genealogy, but I want to walk you through it so that we can can discover some things. I've given you a very simple outline: the price of rebellion, the preservation of reality, and the promise of redemption. Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 10. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived 500 years after he fathered Arpachshad, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Now, a couple of things to notice as we read through this. This section of the genealogy is a little bit different than what we've seen before, because like in the last section of the genealogy, it listed the primary name that was going to carry on the genealogy, but then listed other names by name. You know, Joe gave birth to Sam and his brothers Tom, Dick, and Harry. Here, we don't have that. We have a different pattern in the last segment. It simply says other sons and daughters all the way through. A couple of things that are significant there. It seems that by stepping back from an actual list of names to just include a sort of summary, other sons and daughters, what we're doing is we're acknowledging a couple of things. One, that the birth rate is expanding. That is, families are getting bigger. They're having more children, and so instead of giving the descendants of a person, they're giving the one through whom the line will primarily be recorded, the line of the Messianic promise, and then almost as a throwaway, to simply acknowledge that humanity as the pinnacle of creation, they are rapidly expanding. God has given them the capability to do exactly what he told them to do, which is to go, be fruitful, multiply. Okay? So that's a little bit of a different flavor in this segment versus what we've seen before. The second thing I want you to notice is that the lifespans are noticeably shortening. I mean, like pretty rapidly growing shorter. The first time we saw a genealogy in chapter 5, we were typically in lifespans of 800s to 900s. The second section that we saw previously, lifespans began to be in the 600s and 700s. By the end of this lifespan, by the end of this genealogy, lifespans, we noticed two things. They're having children younger. Remember, go back and look. They were 80, they were 90, they were 65 when they had their first child. And then they had others. Here, now they're having children in their 30s. I mean, they're starting families considerably earlier, but they're also having larger families in the time that's allowed. But what you'll notice is there are no more 600, 700, 800-year lifespans. Now, we're going to max out around 200, and we're going to see Abraham. Abraham is going to die at the age of 175. And from there, through the rest of the Old Testament, it just gets shorter until God actually says that 120 years is the limit. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. From a scientific standpoint, I would argue that it has to do with genetic decay. It has to do with the successive series of cycles as the human body is further and further removed from the perfection of its original creation. So there are scientific reasons for the decline in lifespan. But I think spiritually, again, it's an act of mercy on the part of God, because, frankly, how can I put this kindly? Look at yourself. I'm not being ugly. Look at yourself and then make yourself 10 times older than you are today. Anybody want that? No. No, we don't. Why? Because it's not just the human body that's decaying. Creation itself is increasingly broken. It didn't break and then just stay there. It is declining itself in its functionality. Everything about the created order. Paul uses the language of creation groaning. Everything about the created order is crying out for what? Recreation. We don't want to live 700 years. We don't want to live 900 years. What we want is we want to be fresh. We want to be recreated. And that is the promise. And God gifts us the ability to not wait that long. A parallel idea, back to Tolkien. Tolkien has, without too much explanation, Tolkien has several races of beings, including elves and dwarves and humans in his writings, in the world of Middle-earth that he's created. And the elves are virtually immortal. I mean, they live 10,000 years. And they envy humans. Why? Because humans are mortal. And humans are relieved of the weightiness of life in a broken world in a way that the immortal elves are never relieved. You see, mortality is, in a very real sense, it is the wages of sin. It's the consequences of sin. But because of sin, mortality is also at the same time a gift of release from living in a world of decay and brokenness and sin. We will live in a new world, a new heaven and a new earth. We will have resurrection bodies. There will be no need for tears. The last remnant. You know, it says in Revelation 21 that he'll wipe every tear away. The language of that chapter actually is like a tear that has run down a cheek, and it's just the moistness of the remnant of the tear, and it's as if Jesus just wipes away even the last remnant of it. There's no more reason for this. You don't need to cry anymore. You see, we've got to have a proper biblical grasp of what death means. Because while it is the wages of sin, it is also the gift of mortality so that we can live the life we really were designed and created for, which is a life of new creation, of freshness in the presence of God. All right, all of that is in a sense theologically birthed out of these chapters. All right, let's go back to the genealogy. We see Shem lived 500 years after he fathered Arpachshad, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Verse 12. Arpachshad lived 35 years. See, very young father, considerably speaking in that day. 35 years and fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived 403 years after he fathered Shelah, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Shelah lived 30 years and fathered Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he fathered Eber, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and fathered Peleg. And Eber lived 430 years after he fathered Peleg, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and fathered Reu. And Peleg lived 209 years after he fathered Reu, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and fathered Serug. And Reu lived 207 years after he fathered Serug, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and fathered Nahor, and Serug lived 200 years after he fathered Nahor, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and fathered Terah. And Nahor lived 119 years after he fathered Terah, and he fathered other sons and daughters. Terah lived 70 years and fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died during the lifetime of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the daughter of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. Now let's stop right there. We'll pick that up when we get to it. But here's what I want you to look at. Let's look at the price of rebellion. Like I said, the most obvious fact of this section of the genealogy is the general decline in lifespan. The first child born earlier, the rest of life a considerably shorter period than what we've seen before. The generation of Babel, when Babel actually happened, is the period of Peleg, which he's mentioned in chapter 10, verse 25, and then mentioned here again in chapter 11, verse 17 and 18. The lifespan from Aber, his father, to Peleg drops by half. Peleg lives 239 years. His father, Aber, lives 473 years. That follows the decline. Shem, 600. Arpachshad, 438. Shelah, 433. Eber, 473. Peleg, 239. There's a 200-year drop-off there in the generation where Babel took place. It's a dramatic drop-off. After Peleg, Ru, 239. Serug, 230. Nahor, 148. He, in a sense, relatively speaking, he died young. I mean, that would have been the funeral where people are going, he was such a young man. 148 for him. Terah, 205. Abram, 175. Now, granted, sin had not altogether derailed creation's promise of procreation, the ability to reproduce, but it had altered the power of life in such a way that it diminished longevity. That's why it's really kind of hubris. It's kind of a sort of silly pride in our generation when you see, an article that is trumpeted on the news and the New England Journal of Health or whatever, Journal of Medicine has published some new thing, and they've done the research and the statistics, and lo and behold, the American lifespan has gone from 74.2 to 75.3. Hey, we're living longer. Yeah, well, okay. We're so proud of ourselves. I read an article not too long ago that talking about artificial intelligence, about the mechanical ways that we can now sort of alter the human body. The question was, is it possible? This was the title, I think, of the article. Is it possible for humans to live forever? And I said, yes. Yes, it is. But not as a disconnected brain in a jar attached to a computerized, digitized robot, because that's what they were suggesting. No, there's a better way. You see, the price of rebellion was just that. The wages of sin really is death, and death began to squeeze the human race. It began to move closer. Part of the reason why sin got so outrageous before the flood is if you are naturally, by your physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual constitution, if you are naturally inclined to sin, a 900-year lifespan can let you get into a whole lot of trouble. Death begins to press in. It's the price of sin. And the lifespan gets shorter. But honestly, can you imagine the progression of our rebellious mindset toward God if we had centuries to let it develop and play itself out? The loss of lifespan is not a bad thing, especially with the promise that on the other side of this broken lifespan is the potential for recreation and eternity. This is why it's important for us to think biblically about things. because the world is scrambling to hold on to whatever little bit of life they have. I mean, if a doctor says, there's not much we can do, is there anything? Well, there might be something. Well, let's do it. They're grasping because this is it for a secular worldview that says there is nothing after this. Let me tell you something. When you're 35 years old and strong, you can be an atheist and you can say there's nothing after this. When you die, you die. But let me tell you something. When you're 80 years old and dying is much closer and right around the corner, guess what? It's not nearly as fun of a thought. I've heard atheists say, well, I'm not going to know anything. I'm just going to die. I'm just going to go away. It's not like I'm going to be conscious of anything. Except there is a witness of the way that we've been created. And when we start to get close, guess what? We don't believe our own propaganda. Because we have this nervous tick that says, but what if I'm wrong? Well, they put on a brave face. They'll hold the party line to the end because they're too proud to admit they might be wrong. But let me tell you something. It's easy to be an atheist when you're 35. It's hard to be an atheist when you're 85. Why? Because deep down, despite what we've said our whole lives, deep down, we know better. That's the price of rebellion. It had to happen. But the reason we're given this genealogy as well is the preservation of reality. Think about this. If I can just sort of lay the genealogies sort of where they overlap each other. Let me give you some interesting thoughts. Noah died 58 years after Abraham was born. Shem did not die until Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Shem didn't die until Jacob was 48 years old. Shem outlived Abraham. The great length of life of the forefathers, the original patriarchs, the great length of life was granted as a testimony of warning to the godly successors. Think about it. As mankind in rebellion suffers the Tower of Babel event, and then the story continues to unfold, what better way to think biblically, to assess the way to follow the true God, than to have Shem and Noah and the heroes of the faith alive long enough that they're giving their testimony of what it means to walk with God to multiple generations that come after them. We have this idea because we start in Genesis 12 with Abraham, and we have this idea that God just sort of picked Abraham by random out of the whole earth. He just kind of reached down with his eyes closed and plucked him up and said, I'm gonna use this guy. Abraham didn't just drop off of a cliff somewhere. There's this lineage, this testimony. We say, well, Abraham came from an essentially pagan culture, a culture that didn't, in essence, worship the one true God. That's true, except for the fact that the one true God was not unknown there. And I'll show you how I know that. As this story unfolds, we have these patriarchs who are the repositories of sound tradition. They are the pillars of truth in what is essentially becoming another generation of corruption. You don't have to have very many links when you realize that you can go in an unbroken line from Adam to Methuselah to Shem to Jacob. Who's Jacob? The grandson of Abraham, the father of Joseph. We've got essentially, when you're not talking about generations in terms of years, but in terms of standing in the lineage, we have only 4 generations from Adam all the way to Jacob. That's extraordinary. What was the purpose? The passing along of the testimony of the works of God. That was the purpose. Now, what's the application of that for us? It's this. Nobody in this room is going to see their great grandchildren. You're not going to see 6 or 7 generations that come after you. Nevertheless, if you see your children, your grandchildren, maybe you see great-grandchildren, maybe you see great-great-grandchildren, that's about the limit that we can hope for. But the fact that we can only go that many generations and not a dozen more doesn't change the fact that as long as you and I are breathing air, our job is to be sure that the faith passes to following generations. Listen, there are things that grandparents can say to grandkids that mom and dad will never be heard. There are things that great-grandparents can say to great-grandkids that at the time they're said may seem like some quaint advice from the old guy in the room. But let me tell you, there's a remarkable spiritual transference that happens with godly influence that moves across the generations. Do not let that pass unfulfilled. Well, I've raised my kids. Yeah, you did. Great job. But guess what? If you're not dead and buried, God means for you to have influence on the next generations after that. We don't raise our kids and send them off and go, okay, we're going to Aruba. You can find us on the beach because we are done. Now, you may go to Aruba. I'm all for that. But to disconnect from the family and say it's no longer my job, I did my part, that is a refusal to acknowledge the way God has built the human race. If you have the privilege of grandchildren, we just found out a few days ago, our 6th grandchild is on its way. If you have the privilege of grandchildren, if you have the even rarer privilege of great-grandchildren, guess what? Pay attention and do it on purpose, because that's why you're still here. That's a part of the responsibility that you've been given. The preservation of reality. That's why I use this. That's why I use this title for this point of the message, because these patriarchs of Genesis, they were renowned for their piety. They were preservers of truth, and they had zealous care for the worship of Yahweh. Listen, in our generation, as we approach what I think is the end of days, not only is the decline and the destruction sort of coming to its natural conclusion, but if anything, we are the generation, maybe more than anybody that's ever gone before us, with the dramatic responsibility to make sure that the faith is kept pure and passed down. Occasionally I have people go, I just don't know. I'm worried about my grandchildren. The world is it's just going to hell in a handbasket. I'm just worried about my grandchildren. Yeah, you know what that is? That worry for your grandchildren, that is a God-given motivation for you to take the transmission of the faith seriously into the next generation. Well, I hate to think about the world my grandkids are going to live in. You know why I don't worry about that? Because my grandkids were divinely and sovereignly selected to live in their generation the same way we were designed to live in our generation. When God calls His people to face whatever comes, our grandchildren have been selected to be in that generation. But you know what they need? They need our faith. They need the legacy that we hand to them on purpose. Don't say, I'm just worried about them. Go make them ready. Go make them strong. Go make them able to face the challenges. Listen, parenting and grandparenting have never been more important than they are today. The godly influence of parents and grandparents is meant to extend across multiple generations. If you look in 2 Timothy chapter 2, there's a verse there. Oops, that's the wrong chapter. Let's see. 2 Timothy. I thought I had it marked, but I didn't. 2 Timothy chapter 2. It says this in verse 2. Paul is talking to Timothy and basically giving him instructions about how to pastor a church. He says, "The things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful people who will be able to teach others also." Now, that verse is really in the context of church life. In other words, what we do here, there is instruction from this stage, from the Word of God, but there's significant and important instruction that comes from one-on-one relationships as we walk the Christian life together, arm in arm. Men teaching men how to be men of God. Women teaching women how to be women of God. But the verse has application for the family as well. Entrust the things that you've learned. Do not go to the grave with insights about the kingdom of God, about the way God works, about the way God provides. Do not take those insights and lessons with you. They're meant for those who come after you. I just told my daughter a story the other night that I didn't realize she'd never heard before. And we were talking, and I told her about an incident before we ever had children. Diane and I had only been married a few months, and God just provided for us in some really extraordinary ways. I mean, like jaw-dropping kinds of ways. And I was telling her the story, and she asked me a couple of questions, and she said, "I've never heard that before." I said, "I'm sorry, because I want you to know those stories. I want you to have my testimony of the goodness and the provision of God and the way that He has taken care of us and the way that He's provided for us, because my kids and my grandkids are going to have their own moments when they face challenges that they're not up to, and they need to be able to remember that there's a God who's big enough to deal with what they're facing." That's what we do. You say, "I thought this was a chapter on genealogy." Yeah, it is. And genealogy is not just the record of biological reproduction. Genealogy in the Bible is always the record of spiritual transmission from one generation to the other. Man, we are called to this, folks. The preservation of reality. Well, then let's look at what I've given you here, the promise of redemption. Let's go back to verse 27, because I want to call your attention to the fact that if you'll notice, when we were in chapter 5. If you go back to verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." All right? It acknowledges that this is just the first section of the lineage of promise, but it's the section on Adam. Well, then we get to chapter 10, and it says, "Now these are the records of the generations of the sons of Noah." Okay. Primarily Shem, the one who was given the spiritual blessing. Then we get to chapter 11, and it says in verse 10, "These are the records of the generations of Shem." Each section of the genealogy is sort of marked off with a parallel introduction, which shows that it's essentially a tree related to a particular patriarch. Adam, then Noah, then Shem. And the genealogy is broken up, and these are starting points. I mean, it's an introductory verse. So you go, okay, there's something, and that's why we break it up this way and we teach different lessons, because there's really different emphases that we can learn from studying each section of the genealogy. They're not all just exactly alike. They all tell us some aspect of a developing story. But in the middle of chapter 11, we have that same introductory verse show up again. I mean, it usually shows up as the first verse of a chapter, but the people who broke up the chapters didn't do a new chapter here, but we have a new introductory verse. It's clearly a new segment of the story, and it is in verse 27. Now, these are the records of the generations of Terah. It's the fourth installment, if you will, of this single genealogy of promise. Adam all the way to the founding patriarchs of the nation of Israel. Now, the reason I'm making a big deal about that is because if Abraham was of pagan origin and just sort of picked by random out of the hat, we wouldn't have this kind of genealogical introduction. Or if we did, it would start with Abraham. But that's not what happens here. This section of the messianic genealogy, the genealogy of faith, this last section starts with Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. Now, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, three brothers, much like Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Haran fathered Lot, but dies early. Remember I said Haran died at 148. He was a strapping young kid when he dies. Well, the reason that's included is because later in the story of Genesis, what's going to happen? Abraham is going to take Lot into his family. He is a nephew, but the brother has died. And so that explains where the Lot-Abraham connection comes in. Okay? That's what we have here. But back to verse 27. Terah is the start of this final section. Now, the Jewish tradition, and you always have to be careful here because I'm real big on reminding you that we want to be aware of what the Bible teaches us, and we want to be aware of what it doesn't say. We can't assume some things. And yet, there are some ancient what would be the word? There are some ancient traditions, they're not legends, but there are some ancient ideas that have been around within Jewish culture really from the beginning of the story. And while they don't have biblical authority in the same way that Scripture itself does, they provide some insight sometimes. And one example of that kind of thing is that there are very ancient Jewish traditions that believe that God's offer to follow Him to Canaan, what will be eventually known as the land of promise, the place that God has reserved to give to His chosen people so that the messianic story can unfold into the fullness of time when the Messiah actually is born, when God becomes flesh. That offer by Jewish tradition was originally made to Terah. He was the one that was given the invitation to be the patriarch. But what we have is a sense here of both a failure to obey and a little bit of the taint of idolatry. Let's look at these verses. Now these are the records, verse 27, these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died during the lifetime of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves, and it goes on and talks about the wives. Verse 31, now Terah took his son Abram and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they departed together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Haran is short of the promised land. If the invitation to follow God and to be the patriarch was originally given to Terah, Terah obeyed enough to leave the land called Ur of the Chaldeans. Remember, Chaldea is another word for what would eventually come to be called Babylon. So we're still in the same Mesopotamian region where the Tower of Babel had occurred. Terah leaves Ur of the Chaldees. He travels as far as Haran, but then he stops. And it's very significant because in verse 31, it says that he settled there. The word means dwelt, but it's a Hebrew word that means to dwell permanently. I mean, we would say he moved there. He established himself. He set up housekeeping. What the text seems to say is God said, leave Ur and go to Canaan. And Terah collected all of his family and all of his possessions, and he made his way toward Canaan, but stopped at Haran. And when he stopped at Haran, this is pretty good. I mean, it's a good spot. How about if we just stay here? See, here's the problem. Biblically speaking, partial obedience is complete disobedience. God never says, take 10 steps and then winks at you that he's okay that you only took 7 steps. That's not how it works. He said, go to Canaan. I have a plan. I have a purpose. And Terah apparently said, I'm all in. Up to a point. And then he wasn't. So, what do we know about Haran? Well, that's more than I want to cover tonight, but Haran is a land that tradition tells us was marked by idolatry. A land where the worship of the one true God was not dominant. And for Terah to find himself a place in Haran where he could be comfortable and plant his life was to acknowledge that the promises of God were not enough of a draw to keep him obedient. If we flash all the way forward to Hebrews chapter 11, one of the marks of the Old Testament heroes of the faith, the author of Hebrews tells us that those people, those heroes of the Old Testament, they were looking for the city of God. In fact, if they had been content with the cities that were available to them, they would have stayed there. Why were they pilgrims? Why were they on a journey somewhere else? Because by faith, they believed the promise of what was out there, it was better than the reality of what was right here. Terah thought what was right here was good enough. So he's not the patriarch. Now, whether the tradition is that he was actually given the offer, or if he was supposed to be the means by which Abram would be transported, we don't know. What we do know is the whole enterprise pauses in Haran until Terah dies. Now, we know the years, but we don't know exactly what year it happened, so we don't know how long a so-called delay might have been. It won't be a delay in God's timing, but humanly speaking, the promise of redemption is, in a sense, put on hold by Terah's failure to obey. Haran, I mentioned the father of Lot, he died before they left Ur of the Chaldeans. Nahor marries a woman named Milcah, and he had 8 sons. The reason that's significant is because his son Bethuel will father a child named Laban. Laban will father a daughter named Rebekah. Rebekah will become the wife of Isaac, Abram's son. All right, all of that is fascinating to me. That may be more than you wanted to know. Abram is the other part of this story. Abraham means the exalted one is my father. It's a great Hebrew name. He is a man marked by not perfect faith, but obedient faith. Because here's where we dip into the story again.
Terah, we're back on verse 31. Terah took his son Abram and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, his daughter-in-law Sarah, his son Abraham's wife. They departed together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. That's actually a sad epitaph. We might as well say Terah died short of where God invited him to be. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." What an extraordinary offer. He marries a woman named Sarai. Her name means princess. She was a woman clearly of social standing, of good breeding. But we see that a part of her story is the tension of infertility. That is part of the drama that leads to the miraculous birth of the son of promise, Isaac, when Sarai is 90 years of age and Abraham is 100. In verse 1 of chapter 12, what we have here is really a remarkable roadmap, if you will, for how to encounter God. And I want to just finish with these early verses of chapter 12 because I think there's an important step-by-step process here that you need to understand. Because I think the application of this process, this call to Abraham, I think it has application for us. It starts in verse 1 with a call to separation. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." At some point, Jesus comes back around in the New Testament and has to tell his followers, you may wake up one day and discover that there's a choice between following me and holding on to your family. It's one of the most painful decisions maybe that humans can face. And yet, partial obedience is complete disobedience. The call of God is to be separate, to be all in. I lost a church member one time because he had a son in public and unrepentant sin. And he came to me and he said, I can't walk away from that. I said, you know what? You're not supposed to walk away from your son. But you can't become complicit in his sin. I think about him sometimes because he left the church because he felt like it was impossible for him to maintain his church relationship and his relationship with his son. He couldn't do both. Well, the one thing that's true about that situation is he had accurately assessed his choices. You can't ride two horses at the same time, especially when those horses are going in opposite directions. But his choice was, I know he felt like it was a decision of compassion, and I don't minimize the agony that must have gone with that decision. But he made a decision limited by the time frame of this life, and he sacrificed a decision that will last for all of eternity. There is a time and a place where even our deepest human relationships have to take a back seat to loyalty to Jesus Christ. If at any point those become completely incompatible. Jesus says you can't get behind the plow and follow me, but spend all your time looking backwards. That's not how this life works. You say, well, Pastor, you don't know what you're saying. That's so horrible. What if you have to face that someday? I pray, God, that I never do. But you know what? Either Jesus is true or none of this matters. And if what he says is true, how can I do anything else? There's a call to separation here. Now, verse 2, God gives his intention. I love this. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. What an incredible promise here. He's inviting Abram to follow him and then to make himself known in a way that that he will play out in the life of Abraham. He finishes by saying, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. That is, he extends the messianic purpose of the genealogy. He zeroes it in on a single man who will become a particular family, who will become an individual nation, and the whole world will be blessed as a result. And then verse 4, it says, so Abram went away as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. That's a great verse. Abraham went away as the Lord had spoken to him. In other words, that is the affirmation of Abraham's 100% obedience. And in that verse, Genesis 12:4a, so Abraham went away as the Lord had spoken to him. What we have is the stage is now set for the entire Old Testament, the entire New Testament, the book of Revelation, and all of eternity. The foundations have been laid. The story is in place. And now we're going to see the unfolding drama that will, in the fullness of time, be God becoming flesh and living among us. Don't ever let anyone steal the first 11 chapters of Genesis from your Bible. Don't be embarrassed by them. Don't walk away from them. Don't shrug like they're not that important. This is the bedrock of the story that God is going to unfold. The promise that he made in Genesis chapter 3. He lays the foundation in these first 11 chapters, and then we zero in on Abraham, and we are now off and running. And the Bible has gone from 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds. And we are on a race to the promise of the Messiah, to the crucifixion, to the resurrection, to the second coming, to the marriage supper of the Lamb, to eternity before the throne of grace. That is the story of the Word of God. Father, thank you for Genesis. Thank you for these early chapters, for all that you've given us, the blessing that we have seen as we have gone through this. Thank you for giving us, by your Holy Spirit, insight into the genealogies. Thank you for helping us to stop long enough to discover the lessons there and to not just be put off by the awkwardness of reading genealogy. Thank you that you've given us incredible confidence in your plan from the very beginning. Lord, thank you for the people of Evergreen. I pray that you would bless them as we take a break over the next couple of weeks and as we come back in the summer. Open your word to us again on Wednesday nights in a fresh way and continue to teach us by your Spirit. Father, this is